How's everyone doing, and welcome back to another video. I'm your host Frenzy, and today I want to discuss about the new Wizard101 spells that are coming within the summer test room update of 2025. Bear in mind these spells are subject to change, and I don't believe all these spells are coming immediately. I think specifically the Aquila spells won't be immediate, but I could be wrong on that. However, I want to discuss and their potential viability in the PvE setting. First things first is going to be the poison spell. Path A obviously just keeps the original poison of a shield breaker damage over time spell, or you can go Path B. Path B is what I think will be considered as the future proof spell. This is what makes poison potentially future proof. Even though we don't have many enemies that use negative auras, we could be coming into Arc 5 with enemies that will use them more often, including mobs. With more negative auras being implemented in the game, a spell like the Path B Poison could be very useful. What it does is that it does some death damage, and then it clears that negative aura, so it will remove the negative aura that's placed on you in exchange for 50% death blades. That's a very, very solid spell, and I think this is definitely a future-proof spell for Death Wizard. Next spell is going to be the new Frostbite. Just like Poison, you know, Path A, original path, does more damage. Path B, another blade removal and gives you shields. Again, this is pretty decent. You can use spells like Empowerment for this to get yourself a discount of 1 pip, making Frostbite now cost 4 pips since you will be getting the 1 pip back. We have the new Judgment, and I will say Path B is extremely pathetic. The Echo system, honestly, I haven't really been a fan of that system for Balance Wizards, and I will get more into that potentially in the future video, specifically on Balance Wizards, but Path A is really solid. It does more damage per pip, and I think that's fantastic for any Balance Wizard that just wants a really strong hit. Especially with the magic weaving system, if you weave into life, which I will personally recommend, even though it takes longer, you'll get an aura that will convert your balance damage into life damage, and since you're using that specifically on balance bosses, it's going to give you a stronger judgment because of the boost effect that happens when you are going against balance mobs and balance bosses. Another thing I want to note is that a lot of the so-called pure conditionals, is what I like to call it, now have been changed into gambits. So you don't have a scenario where if you happen to have a specific effect on you, you'll get an extra or like a special effect. Now you have to remove that specific effect to get a condition going. In this case, that's kind of what a gambit is. It's something that benefits you being removed in exchange for something else, like a special utility. In the case for Storm Shark, you essentially are sacrificing a heal overtime on yourself to do more storm damage on Storm Shark. And a lot of the spells that were once pure conditionals are now going to have a gambit. At least that's the trend that I was seeing as of recent. Raging Bull is another good one. Honestly, I think this would make DOT styles a lot easier. Obviously, we have a lore spell that does detonate 2 DOTs, but that's pretty much all it does. However, Raging Bull is a little bit of a special case. With its Shadow Pip requirement, now not only will it detonate 2 DOTs, but it will also boost the damage effect of the DOTs by 180%. We are essentially talking about having applied a 80% blade on 2 damage overtimes, which could be really useful for certain strategies that tend to rely on damage overtimes. One of the biggest issues with fire and just DOT styles in general, at least in the PvE setting, is that the setup is quite a bit, but you don't really get much value out of it in terms of damage, since you weren't necessarily able to manipulate that damage for a certain period of time. Now we have more spells that could potentially detonate, and those spells are like the detonate spell that fire gets, but that's not necessarily as reliable. We have spells like Firecat that's cheap, easy to use, Troll, which will detonate 2 overtimes as well, with the sacrifice of a shield, and now we have spells like Raging Bull, which not only manipulates to detonate the DOT, but also makes DOTs do more damage. That's really solid. Finally, we're going to be going over the Aquila spells. Now, my personal favorite definitely has to go to the Fires of Mars. The neat thing about Fires of Mars is that the Path A is what allows everyone to use a DOT type strategy. And this is really thanks to the chromatic effect that this spell tends to have. So we are looking at 3 damage overtimes based on the caster's school. So if you're a Storm Wizard doing this, then a Storm Wizard can essentially have 3 DOTs with this spell, if you happen to use this spell. Path B, it's alright. I wouldn't really recommend doing Path B for PvE purposes. Sure, it does, outright damage instead of overtime damage, but I will say, if you are able to potentially manipulate damage overtimes, which you should be able to if you happen to have a Spellement Troll, you can just buy those off in the bazaar. Or if you happen to be lucky enough to have Raging Bull, which not only will manipulate the DOT, but also make it do a lot more damage. I would say probably stick with Path A, and the reason why is because this is going to be really solid for bosses that tend to shield quite a bit, but you're still trying to do some pretty solid damage without having to overly rely on single target hits. Next spell is going to be Neptune's Fury. This is essentially the Poseidon spell. So its original effect is going to be doing some ice damage and then apply 2 ice traps on the enemy. I will say, this is a little bit of an unfortunate situation, as the utility won't necessarily be as useful in my opinion in terms of PvE, because typically for a spell with that cost, you will probably prefer that it is used as a finisher rather than a spell that is used for its utility purely. Path B is going to have a Blade Clear effect, which is very common in a lot of ice kits. The traps are very powerful. Again, this could be a spell that might be pretty useful for advanced content type stuff, but in general casual PvE, I wouldn't really recommend it personally, just because, again, very high pip cost. Storms will be getting Jupiter's Might. Now, this is essentially Zeus. So we're looking at 750, or rather 730 storm damage, and then applies a negative aura where they will be taking some increased incoming chromatic damage. So let's say if you're like a myth wizard using this, then it would be like a plus 35, extra myth damage for 4 rounds. Path B is going to be doing a little bit more in the sense of outright damage, being 850 now. And when you clear 3 damage overtimes, you will then be applying 35% chromatic incoming damage, but this time it's going to be 6 rounds instead of 4 rounds. Again, this suffers with the same issue as Neptune's Fury. You will prefer to use this spell as a finisher more than anything, so I really wouldn't recommend this either. Saturn's Reaping, which is going to be Cronus. Its original effect is going to be 635 myth damage and 3 35% chromatic traps at the target. Now, this is interesting, but again, it does suffer from the fact that it needs to be used more as a finisher rather than purely for its utility. Path B is going to be some more outright myth damage, but you are to sacrifice 4 shields for more powerful chromatic traps at the target. Now, I do like the utility, but again, this does suffer from the issue that it is a very expensive spell, and in the casual PvE sense, you will probably prefer using this as a finisher more than anything else. Hello everyone, Frenzy from the future here, discussing some of the changes that have been made with the June 2nd release of the Summer Test Realm update for the Aquila spells that will be coming within the summer update. These 2 spells that I want to talk about specifically are going to be Pluto's Peril and Phoebus' Will, or as I like to call, the Apollo spell. Because every other Aquila spell, the main difference is that the utility effect is stronger now, and that's pretty much it. Again, I do find that cool. However, the same issues that I have with the spell to begin with are still the same issues that I have now, even with the update. So let's specifically talk about the 2 spells that actually had some sort of meaningful change to the point that they're now completely different spells. Clueless Peril now does 500 death damage and applies a minus 25% negative aura of outgoing damage to the target. Essentially, what you're doing is applying a weakness aura to the target. And it's a cool utility, but the main issue I have with this now is that you can no longer use spells like Adapt to your advantage with this one. And with that being said, because of its high pip cost, I would say you would probably prefer using a different spell, because with the high pip cost, you'd rather be using this for a finisher than just primarily for its utility. Sure, there might be some cases you might actually use this, like if you happen to have a battle that has a damage cap, but beyond that, it's not as useful for the casual, or as I like to call the general PvE sense. If you still want to utilize Adapt to your advantage though, I would recommend potentially going Path B. You are able to train some negative auras already, and with more negative auras potentially coming along the way, you might be able to utilize this to the best of your advantage. Applying a negative aura to an enemy with Adapt and gabbing it in order to get yourself a pretty good defensive with offensive type spell. As for Phoebus Will, or as I like to call the Apoyo spell, it does 610 life damage and detonates 3 damage overtimes for 130%. Essentially, with the additional booster being 30% per damage overtime, which that's also really cool. This is a very cool spell on paper, but as I was trying to think of combinations for the spell, the only thing I could really think of for Life Wizards is something like the Life Divum spell in order to do some pretty decent damage. But to get the full effect of the spell, you will have to dual school with Fire most likely, along with getting yourself some Fire stats, as Fire is most notably known for their overtime capabilities. You can use spells like Glimpse of Infinity for some pretty decent overtime damage, but at that point, in order to get the full benefit, you will have to rock some dual schooling pins as well with Fire stats in order to get some pretty good damage out of it. And also, this will require you to rock both a Fire pip and a Myth pip, along with still keeping 5 pips total to utilize this spell. Then finally, we're going to be going over the balance. I'm just going to call it the balance bird because I don't know how to pronounce this spell, but I would like to call this essentially the Starbucks version of Savage Paw. Very overly priced. That's kind of my takeaway from this spell. Its original effect is going to be doing some bounce damage and apply 2 25% universal blades. It's really just overly priced Savage Paw. That's literally all it is. I personally wouldn't really recommend this spell whatsoever. It's pretty terrible. I will say though, with spells like Adapt, you could get a refund for like 6 pips, but at that point, just use Savage Paw. I believe it does slightly less damage, but again, it's much cheaper too, and a lot easier to be spammed. And I believe even the blades might be either the same or stronger, so that's why I like to call this the Starbucks spell of Savage Paw equivalent. Path B, however, we have the Echo effect where 7 blades are going to be into 35% blades, so you're essentially sharing the fact that if the enemy has a handful of blades, you get a handful of blades, but your handful of blades will be universal blades of 35%. There just isn't really much scenarios where you might be utilizing that into your advantage, and because you usually will be using this spell as a finisher, if you even wanted to use this spell as a finisher, there are just better options out there in my opinion. But with that being said, that will be it for me. Hopefully you guys took a little bit of inspiration from this video to probably try out something new in the future if you are to consider potentially using these spells for PvE content. As always, if you did enjoy today's video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe if you haven't, and always remember to stay frenzy, and peace.